Three. Do we have audio? Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Remember last time I had to bail out and come back in? You know that?
Says we're live. And
are we on the right link? This is the one posted in the media group.
okay, let me send this again. Just
It says live.
Yeah.
I'm getting something now. After
Check.
closing it, I can see it now.
We still have you on the Ember, so it is delayed a bit.
oh, you can hear me?
Yeah. There. Well,
Says we're live. Okay, perfect. All right. We're doing it live. So today we're getting together at Riverside IO and having a Friday on air session with Judd, Matt, myself, and Mark upstairs, and anyone else joining online, or welcome if you're joining us at some other time later in the day or in the future. Welcome to Riverside IO. And so one of the things we're doing here is just sharing some technology that we're interested in or exploring or using on Friday afternoon. And today we're looking at the JSON API.org specification, which I believe will be coming to a 1.0 release in May. So if you're not familiar with JSON API.org, check it out. And one of the interesting things is when you hear about a JSON API, like everybody builds a JSON API. Like, so I want to kind of throw that around the room real quick. Like, what's your expectation when someone tells you, hey, we have this API, it's JSON? Like, what do you expect? Any idea? Yeah.
nested, you know,
Yeah.
JSON objects.
So yeah, so maybe nested JSON objects, maybe not necessarily a consistent format, right? Like I'm gonna have to parse that stuff. But it should be RESTful, right? Like, yeah, well, what about relationships? Is that in terms of, hey, this record relates to this other record?
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, okay, yeah, I gotcha. So, yeah, I think this project is gonna kind of dial that in for everybody who wants to build something in a common format. And I think the other interesting point too is like, so once you've written your API, like how much time do you invest in your documentation for all your users? Maybe if it's like, you're paid to do that and it's a service that you have to do as a service. But typically, if you just have internal developers consuming your API, like they're just going to have to be your QA and call your API. And like, oh, that's how it works. Why did these attributes not match up? You know? So I'm not suggesting to skip documentation altogether or using something like a Swagger doc. But what I am suggesting is that the format for the JSON API is pretty pleasing in terms of, you know, how we should represent a resource in JSON, how we should, you know, do RESTful operations on it, like CRUD and changing things, as well as relating data, and other common needs about like sorting, paginations, filtering, including related records if there's some nesting or side loading. So the documentation here is pretty dialed in. So we won't dive too deep into the docs, if you will, but just take a couple examples to look at in terms of formatting. So if you can see my screen here, there's a JSON payload, and the first property in the object is a data property. And there's also a type. And essentially there's an ID. You know, every record that's represented somewhere in a database probably needs an ID. And in this case, there's attributes. And that's up to you, what you put aside from type and ID. And this spec, again, it's reaching a 1.0, so there's a couple things that may change. But at a high level, your data is always going to be there. And in addition, you may have something like meta, and you can put in there, you know, page properties and have offset and limit and sort by and this kind of thing. Also links, if this particular resource, it links to another resource, you know, you can spell out what that path is so it's discoverable, and which makes it follow sort of the hypermedia way of doing things. As well as included. So if you're including objects in the same payload, you know, you may have other nested resources under the included attribute of the payload. So how does that look? So here's a type that's an article with ID 1. Its attributes has a title. And oh, maybe this is new. I don't remember using attributes, but it looks like everything's under attributes now. And then it links to an author. And essentially it has a URL or a URI to that author. So you can just kind of discover that as you explore the API. And then in terms of relationships, in the links object, there's like a self, a related, a linkage, as well as meta. So you have a link to yourself, right? So if I'm an article ID number 1, the link to myself is, example.com/articles1. So that's where you are. And then how does that relate to other things? Like you have an author and they're at almost the same URL /links author. So one of the things I'm really liking about JSON API spec is the ability to operate on associations between resources very programmatically and very specifically without having to throw the whole payload around. Like I just want to link this thing and I don't want my API to say, oh, I have a payload and you have a list of IDs. So that means I have to do something magic like change the order, or because somehow your JSON client or your JavaScript client dropped one of them when you sorted it. It's like, oh, I should delete things now because it's not there anymore. So it kind of decouples that mixed concern of what's inside your attributes of your payload and separates them to just links. So let's take a look at a working example. A blog is always a great example, or an employee manager or something like that. So I'm going to open up PAW here, and I should be running locally. It's a Postgres back database with a Rails API front end, and the gem I'm using is the JSON Resources gem. So if I just want to get all the posts, let's see if it's working on live. So I've published this API at api.pixelunloader.com, and I'll use this for my blog. So in this request, I'm also limiting how I sort and what fields I'm displaying. So I'm showing the title and the date and getting some pagination stuff here at the bottom. Obviously, when I load my blog, I don't want to load every post on the home page, so we can use the meta values to know where we're at. I have 66 total. I started at 0 and was only requested to see 5. And I'm sorting by date. The interesting thing about the sort is they're using, looks like, arithmetic operators, minus date. So it's descending. It's kind of weird to see that in a URL because it's going to encode that in your URL and you might not notice it as well. And that's on live. So that's what I'll use for my blog. So that's just getting resources. And then, so what are they related to? Let's look at something that's related. Actually, yeah, here's an author. Okay, so I want to get a post author. So I have post number 2, and it has links, and it has an author. So that's an endpoint to just give me the author. And there it is. It's author ID 1. And it doesn't have all the information, right? It just has basic information about who the author is. But if I want to get the post author resource, the URL is going to be slightly separate. I'll just remove the links. So you can just get specific link information, or you can get the actual author's resource. And then again, it's discoverable. So I have, if I want to get the author's post, I can do that. I think I have that saved somewhere. Get author's posts. So author 1, their links and their posts. Again, those are all their posts. And if I want to get their post resources, this is probably going to be a big payload. Yeah, it's all kinds of junk, right? It's all the things that author wrote. So that's, fetching data. In terms of creating data, I have authentication set up. So we're looking at a way to authenticate.
There's an echo.
Oh,
Let you know.
oh, thanks, bud.
I wonder if
It's probably my speakers. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. So those of you who are in the stadium, welcome to the World Series. Not really. Yeah. So again, we're going to look at some authentication. And in my body, I have a username and a password. And what I'm expecting back is just going to be an auth token. I'm not using any headers. So you might use the JSON API specific headers, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. So just post that and get back a current token. So now that I have a token, essentially I can operate on these resources. I want to maybe create a post. Okay. The JSON API has a specific header that you can use for content type, like application/vnd.api plus JSON, rather than just application JSON. So if your Rails or whatever backend doesn't understand that, you have to teach your app to understand that content type. The JSON Resources gem already understands that, so that works pretty well. So what I want to do, I want to create a post. So on air. All right, so we'll just put some property in there. Excerpt in there. And slug. What's today, the 8th? Okay. Hopefully this works. There it is. Okay, so here's all the links. I got links to my author. I got links to the author's resource, links to myself. I want to find this again later. To get a post by ID. And this is what I was talking about earlier. That was number 67, right? Okay, so I'm going to include the author in this request. So maybe that didn't work, did it? Include author. Oh, that's broke. Sorry about that. That should work. I'm not sure why that's not working today. Either way, so that's a quick look at creating resources. Probably should look at updating your resource as well. Create. Oh, you know why I didn't get an author? I didn't link an author. So it doesn't have an author. So I need to add an author. Link post author.
You're not on.
I'm not even on.
Yeah.
I wonder if your microphone's on, like on the computer itself. I don't know.
Yeah, it probably is. Okay, audio difficulties. Hold on a second. Yeah, but yeah, there's not much I can do.
I'm wondering if it's your headphones versus maybe just take the headphones out.
Check. Okay, we only have one audio source. Hopefully this works.
We'll get this down.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a couple of.
Cool. Alrighty, so I need to link up this author. So I'm going to say, hey, post 67, I need to link up an author. Probably need that auth key again, don't I? So basically, I'm just using an authorization header. Link post author. I want to say, hey, post number 67, you're going to be linked to author number 1. So now if I get post with author link, and that's create, I need to get.
Doesn't show you the full request that she did, the full URL.
Yeah, it should say it right here. Yeah, it's right there, it's related. But I have something like with author already saved.
Include, yeah, right?
Yeah, get posts.
Right there, get author, get post author.
Post by ID. There it is. Okay, I didn't name it. So we're going to get post by ID, and we're going to get post number 67 and include the author this time. Record not found. Oh, that's on live. Hey, there it is. So now we have a payload with data and included resources. So essentially my links will say that, hey, you have an author and here's your linkage, type ID 1. So in the same payload, if included is present, I can find by ID number 1, there's my author information, name and email. So then I wouldn't need to make 2 requests, right? I can just kind of sideload this data. And notice that it's not really embedding the resource. It kind of favors the sideloading. Mm-hmm. So how does this work in an Ember app or any JavaScript client? It works just the same way it does in my REST client, right? You just kind of make these requests. But I do have an example of this running on a server that I'd like to give a quick little demo on. So if I go to blog.pixelhandler.com, this is a copy of my blog at pixelhandler.com, which is currently running with like sockets and Node and all this craziness I've experimented with. So let me kind of back it back down to something that's a standard, like a specification, like JSON API. And I'll take a look at the console and see what it's doing. So we got network, XHR. I don't need the console. All right, let's reload. So ignore these metrics right now. I have that endpoint shut off. So it's getting, just like we demonstrated, with some limitations, page limit at 10. And there it is. We got some metadata with the sorting, as well as all of my resources, which we actually see on the screen. So if I want to interact with a specific endpoint in a single page application, all these things are already loaded, right? So they'll just be real snappy. If I go to the archive page and start loading some older ones, you know, I still have to fetch those things. What I'd like to show is that it'll still also get that single resource in a single page application just by using this key. Notice I'm not saying post 67 or post 23. I'm using slugs. So in my repository on GitHub, which I'll share at the end, there might be some nice little code snippets you can borrow if you like. So we'll just reload this page and look at that request. So now we're looking for a specific post by ID. Actually, we're getting 2 things. Oh, my related posts on the side. It has to still get those by 10. Oh, I don't actually see the request. It's weird. I know I got it. Did you guys see it on there? I only see 1 post request. Oh, there it is. Upgrade to Lion went well. Okay, cool. So it's getting without the ID because I'm also searching by ID or by slug. And it's cached, it's not modified. So my API using JSON Resources is smart. It's caching all the things for me, which is very cool. Do I have CloudFront in front of this yet? No. Yeah, okay, so that's just baked in. And so there's the single resource with its links. So you see the author information there, handler, and you know the title and the slug and all these things that were part of our resource. So what library did I use to build these things? I didn't use Ember Data. Ember Data probably does have a JSON API adapter. Since it's moving so fast, I'm not sure if it's current. So we'll look at that in a second. I don't know my password. 1 second.
To call the blog more often.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay, so whatever. We could use the local one later. You've already seen in the REST client about creating resources. We don't need to do it with a web form on the blog, but the blog form has to create, edit, and change these resources. I did want to show updating a record. I'm not sure. Hey, there it is. Okay, cool. So let's edit a resource real quick. Let's say that this is not practical. Let's edit it again. It is practical. Okay. Okay, so this is a put request, and what did it send? It sent just what was changing. So this is kind of handy, right? Instead of sending the entire payload, we're just going to send, we always need the ID and the type, but the only field that I changed is the title. So we'll just send that one over the wire, speaking JSON, and hey, it's great. One little thing at a time. It's really snapping really fast. So that's a nice feature of Ember Orbit. Notice I didn't have to say, oh, save this. You know, it just responded to my model having a changed property, and I'm observing that when I blur. So there's another request there. The response gives you, it looks like the full payload. So you're like, hey, you put something, and here's the current state of your resource. There it is, if you like it. One thing I would like to look at is Ember Orbit real quick. GitHub. How are we doing that time?
I think we have.
We're good, huh?
Yeah, we
Okay,
scheduled
yeah.
to 1:15 if I remember right.
Okay. So there's Orbit.js. Orbit.js is like a repository pattern. You can link multiple sources. And what we're using here is a JSON source and a JSON serializer. So they have in their common library both a JSON source and a JSON API serializer. So I said that wrong. It's a JSON API source. And think of the source as like all of your adapter methods, right? Like I need to get something via REST, and how do I do that with XHR? Well, I use $Ajax with jQuery. So I may have to tell this source, hey, I'm using $Ajax. But it's going to have like an Ajax method and essentially wrap that for you and do some stuff like work with the known format and the current specification, so you don't have to figure all those things out yourself. It also has a hook to kind of transform things. So the interface is documented really well on the website itself. So they have these transform classes, and here we go. So requestable and transformable. When I'm working with the source right now, I'm kind of working through the requestable. I'm saying, hey, I want to find, I want to create, I want to update. They also support the JSON patch spec, which is pretty cool. I've experimented with that. We're not going to talk about that today. And then transformable, like I actually am using two sources. I'm using the JSON API source, and I'm using a memory source. So I'm going to ask my memory source, and if it doesn't have it, it's going to be helped by the JSON API source. And next time I ask my local store object, it'll ask the memory source, and it'll already have it, so it won't have to make the request. So that's the requestable interface. The transformable has to do more when things change, right? So if the JSON API source does make the find requests, it can transform that back into memory and say, oh, here it is, you know, now you have a copy of that. And so internally, the transform uses JSON patch internally. So it'll work off operations like add, remove, or I think it's replace, and it'll have a path to exactly what's being replaced. And this library, Orbit.js, is ambiguous or doesn't care about what client-side libraries you're using. It'll work with any JavaScript library. Now, Orbit.js has an implementation in Ember. So there's Ember Orbit. And this kind of follows a lot of the patterns that Ember Data has established in terms of working with REST for a JavaScript application, and how you interact with a memory store and how you make requests. So it has like a store object, and you can find all the things or filter all the things or retrieve something specific like planet number 123. And then it exposes all these methods. Like I want to find, add, remove, patch, or I want to find a link or add a link and remove a link. And that's why I feel like it's really powerful, because if you have a resource and you want to like change something about it, like who it's related to, you're not sending the whole payload around. There's not going to be a data collision, like somebody else was editing that resource and you decided to link it to that person who's editing it now, and they jumped ahead of you and saved it, and then you saved it because you wanted to assign them to it, not yourself, and now you clobbered their changes because your client application has been sending around entire payloads of your entire representations of your resource. So it's a really nice way just to say, oh, I just want to change the link, and that's it. It has a model object that you can use and relationships that you can set up. So in my example, we're just using posts and authors and this kind of thing. But I just wanted to call out that there's great documentation here. There's a little bit of setup still, and probably a little bit of hackery that still needs to happen. I know the author of this library is working diligently to bring the JSON API source and serializer up to speed with the current spec on the website. And as it's still going through some finalized changes as approaching 1.0, it's hard to keep a library in sync with that. So again, I'll point to my repositories on GitHub where you can see these examples. So we'll take a look at that real quick. GitHub.com/pixelhandler. Blog and blog API. So this blog is going to be the client app, and you'll see that I have sources. I put them in adapters. So I have an application adapter, and I'm going to extend the JSON API source and do some little fixing up of things until this library is intact and at a 1.0 state. But it wasn't so bad. I just had to fix a couple methods, the ones that I were interested in about updating an attribute. They have like a standard method and a patch method. That may change. Notice these are underscored. But I just dug right out of their code and shifted it so it fit with the current specification. So that's the application adapter. And then also I have a serializer, which is an application serializer. And this one had to do a little bit more work about deserializing, assigning meta, and serializing links and this kind of thing. But the interface is pretty dialed in, right? It was obvious what I needed to change when it was a little bit out of sync, and I was like, oh, I need to serialize the records. Oh, and I need to serialize the record. There it is. So that wasn't so bad. One thing that was interesting was the meta, like assigning meta. I don't know that that's a particular standard. The specification has some guidelines, but you can do what you will and you want to do with assigning meta. So in here, I'm saying like, oh, I need to use this total. This total is really important to me. So I know how many total resources I have, so I can use my URL parameters like limit and offset and know when I'm done. So to set up Ember Orbit, there's a little bit of ceremony, and in Ember you can do things like initialize things. So we'll initialize Ember Orbit, and so I'll have this application source and serializer. I'll have to give it $Ajax so it understands what that is, and give it some options like where my host is and what my API path is, like API/version1. What my serializer class is, and that I'm not using patch. As soon as that's ready, I'll use that because I really like the syntax and how small the payloads are. Ember Orbit has a concept of a schema that kind of keeps a representation of your records and how they're related. So I think I had to set that up and say that, oh, I'm using an ID field. If you're using something like _ID, you could change that. And then this is kind of where some of the repositories being connected comes together. So I'm going to have two stores. I'm going to have one store, the main store, but then I'm going to have a secondary. So the main store is just going to be Ember Orbit store, which I think implements like a memory source. And I'm going to have a secondary, which is a JSON API store. And so what we'll do is connect these sources. And so I have a primary and a secondary. I'd like to add a third one. I'd like to add a local store, which is local storage. And I know that there's still some work being done on those adapters that will be in Orbit's common library. But ideally, it would be cool to ask my store in memory, like, hey, do you have this representation of this resource? And it says, no, let me check local store. Local store is like, oh, I need some assistance, like rescue me JSON API source. And JSON API source says, yep, I got it. And then it transforms back through those connectors. And I drive under a tunnel and I lose Wi-Fi and I reload the page, so it's not in memory. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, I wanted to look at that, finish reading it. Now it's in local store. So I think this is going to be a really good story for connecting multiple sources with a JavaScript application using Orbit.js. And this is an Orbit pattern, not necessarily an Ember Orbit pattern. You can just connect multiple sources. So I'll need to set up those connectors, and that's going to be done here, where I'm going to transform a connector. Here's my primary, and here's my secondary. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to transform the connector between the secondary and the primary. So basically, it just passes through. You ask one for something, it'll rescue it and get it from the other one, and vice versa. So on assist find, on the primary store, I'm going to say, hey, memory store, if you can't really find it, ask the secondaries find method, and it can help you. And that's why I can ask my memory for a resource, and then my JSON API source, who is secondary, says, oh, let me find that for you, and assist the find. There's a rescue find and an assist find, and you just kind of work out how you want sources to be connected. So I think this is a really strong pattern for working with objects in a JSON application. So anyway, so this is my blog. You can see the source code and clone it if you want, make your own blog. I talked about the API, and I think to me this is the real interesting part. I'm leaving my Node API, which I implemented the JSON spec myself and kind of tracked to JSONAPI.org and wanted to do all the new things and make it awesome and connect the socket to it. But now that that specification is becoming more final, I don't want to do all those things and maintain all that stuff. I just want to plug in a serializer and build stuff. So this is a Rails app created with Rails API gem. So there's no view layer. It just, JSON is the view. And the serialization of the models is done with the JSON Resources gem. And this is being developed by the same people who have been working on the Orbit project. And it's really powerful. There's a demo app called Peeps, as well as, you know, what I'm sharing now, the blog API. And, you know, it tells you how to set it up, just gem install. And there's it's not really a mix-in. If you're familiar with like active model serializers, you need a serializer, right? So JSON Resources, JSON API resource thinks about things as resources, not as models, for example. But it looks very similar to what you might be familiar with active model serializers, where you can define attributes. And I have this resource, which is extending the JSON API resource. And then I have some methods where I can concatenate properties and create sort of a computed property just for the JSON representation, if you will. It doesn't have to be model logic. And then there's this thing called fetchable attributes, creatable and updatable attributes. So you can have a layer of protection if you want. I haven't explored that yet, but I think that is something that's very important when you're building an API. Some people can see certain attributes, some people can't. I'm curious about how that's going to play out, right? Like, should you always have a post resource and always show a complete representation? Or do you nest something and say, these are protected attributes? And so there's the attributes in the spec. I might kind of like to see something different that was protected attributes. That way, what's in attributes would be, hey, those are always the attributes. I can always count on those things. So I don't know if that's in the spec yet. That might be something to experiment with at this time and bring it up to the JSON API team and say, hey, what do we do with protected attributes that not a known representation. Maybe it's an unknown only by certain people. Where do they look for that? Should it be in the attributes hash or should it be somewhere else? I'm not sure if this spells that out yet. But it does have the associations, you know, has one or has many, and it's that simple. You know, you're not doing something like active record-ish, you know, has one and belongs to through this. You know, you just name what it is, and there it is. So it can have multiple things, right? So let's look at the example in the blog example, since we've been talking about a blog. What did I set up? I used the Postgres app, and boom, I had a database backend. I used bundle. Everything was set up. I have some references here for how I use slugs and how I use token auth. You know, Rails is great with protecting your password by default, and so you know, there's a lot of history to it. So, anyways, let's look at a couple models. So let's look at the post model. So basically, I'm going to validate that I have a slug and it's unique because I'm going to use that like an ID, and pretty much that's it. I need to say that that's a param, and this belongs to author. Simply, an author has many posts, and the posts belong to the author, and oh, we already looked at that. Yeah. Oh, I didn't look at the user. So the user has a secure password and you know, some validation around username, password. Has some generate token auth and find by credentials in the lib directory. I borrowed some objects from that blog post that you saw listed in the README. Essentially, I need to have a decoded auth token and an auth token. So if you want to borrow this authentication, help yourself. I borrowed it as well. That's how I got the authorization header. And so those are the models. Now let's look at the serialization. So also in the app, we have a resources directory, and I have it as API v1, and I have an author resource, which basically has a few attributes, and it has many posts. So it has to match up your route, right? So my route says API/v1/author. So you have to nest that as well. Same thing with the post resource. And this is where, you know, there's a lot of things baked into JSON Resources, like it has a paginator already. So I can use that. And I wanted to do something a little non-standard. So I'm redefining this find by key method so that I can first check for a slug. And secondarily, if I don't find it using the slug, we'll just treat it as an ID, the primary key, which would be the ID, or whatever you define. There is a little bit of setup. I think there's an initializer. So let me back up to the API. Those are in config, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so we have JSON. So basically, the default paginator is going to be offset. My default page size is going to be 5. If I don't say, you know, what my limit is, it'll just be 5. The maximum is 100. Like, I don't want to tax the system with, you know, 100,000 resources. Like, hey, just keep asking, right? So those additional, we looked at the resources, we looked at the models, we looked at the initializer. I think that was it. Like, and I got all those, and we look at the controllers, yeah. So under controllers, I have an API controller, which is extending the JSON API resource controller. And the before action says, hey, you need to authenticate this stuff. Why? Because you're an API, right? So it has some methods around that. And again, these were borrowed from that blog post on how to do authorization tokens in an API. So my API under, I'm not versioning my auth, like that's done. Like, you know, if I change it, I change it. Like you can't log in, who cares? You know, nobody should see a change there. So the auth controller is going to extend the application controller. It'll skip the before action to authenticate the request because obviously you're not authenticated. So that's real simple. And then also under the V1, I have, again, authors and posts. So skip before action. And this is where it was interesting. I have get related resource or get related resources. So now you got to think about, like, what are we talking about? What am I skipping? Well, all the get stuff, they don't have to be authorized for that. So I chose, you got to be authorized for everything except these things, right? So index show the association, like, hey, where's the links? And then, oh, give me those links resources. That should all be available. So we can skip the before action to set a user and authenticate the request for all the get related stuff. And I forget, this is just a Railsy thing, right? Like you got to say what the strong parameters, yeah. And then so for the posts, it was a little bit different. It was get related resources instead of get related resource. I found that out by accident, like it wasn't working. I typed the S and it was working. Probably should have read the docs, but same thing, you know, it's not too hard to, you know, have a full-fledged API with a standard specification. Anybody who wants to, you know, use your API as a client knows how to create resources, how to find resources, how to link resources. I'm really impressed. I'm sold. So yeah, these are some things I thought maybe you want to borrow to implement your pagination or improve. You know, I did a real quick hacky job here. And what I did was just dig right into the JSON API project and redefine these methods to do the things that I wanted to do instead of trying to call super, because I was like, I'm lost. And it just worked. So again, I only had to do a couple little things to support slugs, to, you know, include pagination the way I wanted to include pagination, to protect my resources with authorization header. You know, if you built APIs in the past, that was a lot of work. I think the work is getting streamlined. Yeah. So, and again, Rails 5 will have the Rails API is kind of a standard flag when you install. So this is probably Rails 5 compatible, I hope.
Yeah, it looks like it's
Yeah.
built into Rails 5, and then also there's a JSON API adapter for active model too, so that'll
that's cool. Yeah, so you have choices out there. Yeah, so I'd like to just pause now for questions. I know I've been rambling. Hopefully it's still being recorded accurately. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Not for me, no.
No?
Yeah. So, but in general, it seems like your experience was positive. You're sold on the concept of standardizing
Yes.
JSON API. I think that's a good effort for sure. And it was easier. Was it easier than you thought, or
way easier than I thought? So I've done this
thought.
once before. So I've been following the spec and it was like, oh, you know what? There's a lot to it, right? So I'm going to implement just the methods I need and then go from there. And then I got really excited about patch because I wanted small payloads. Like if you work in e-commerce or something and you have Akamai in front of it and you got millions of users, like you're paying for everything that goes through the wire.
Right.
And so why send around complete representations of resources? So the JSON patch spec is sort of a plugin. And how do we say this? I'm trying to define what they call it. Let me find patch. Yeah, we'll follow up on that later. It's in here. Yeah. Oh, extensions. They call it an extension. So the JSON patch extension deals with payloads as operations. Like here's the operation, here's the path, here's the value, and here's the attributes. So you can, you know, create resources very similar, but from an operational perspective. So this is the same internal format that Orbit is using to transform resources. So I was like, why not just use that everywhere, you know, and updating attributes. So I want to replace this path. But what if the path was like source / nested things or number 5 in an array? It can be very specific about what you operate on. And so you're gonna, here's the path to that thing you're changing, and then here's the changing value. The other thing it has is a concept of test. Like for example, if you wanted to send up a change right now, I send up put, right? Like put the title. But what if I set like put the title, and here's what I think the title is. And server, if that's the truth, go ahead and make the change. But if that's not the truth, send me an error, and send me what it really is. And I'm like, oh, well, I like that one better. So JSON patch spec has a concept of sending an operation with a test, and so you can validate your change by confirming the test. So that to me is really appealing. Like patching a single piece of a resource, that can save bandwidth, with a lot of users. But so can the JSON patch in terms of getting specific attributes or incomplete representations. I think the JSON spec allows you to say with fields and still get incomplete representations. For example, if you have a list view, like I just need the things to show in the list. I don't need all the things or the post body and this large payload. And that's still something that has to be solved in client-side MVC-ish applications about like how do you deal with incomplete representations plus complete representations? Because you saw that I connected those two sources. They think that those are valid representations, but I kind of would like in my lists on the side just to have titles. In my list, in the home page, just to have titles and excerpts. And then when I click through to finally get the body. So maybe then I would just ask it for, give me that same thing I already know about plus the body. So, using a library is cool, but I mean, $Ajax is cool too. You know what I mean? But like what I like about the JSON API.org spec is everything's spelled out. Like you don't have to use a library that has it all baked for you. You can use just what you want with $Ajax, and you can optimize how you want to deal with a representation of a resource very creatively and being smart about, your bandwidth, if you will. So I'm excited about that. So with the orbit, maybe you do have a source that is like an incomplete source. And then you edit your transforms to say a rescue says, oh, maybe later I'll get that stuff. And I don't know, those are things to think about. But so I started off last year with the patch spec and kind of built that out myself. I was really happy with it because I set it up with sockets. So I was just communicating little tiny pieces really fast back and forth and was excited about that.
Now, is your blog using the new?
My blog is using the old
So
JSON API spec. There was a previous round of this spec before it approached 1.0. So I need to switch it over. Tonight I might switch it over. So I have blog.pixelhandler.com, which is the Rails app with the current spec ready to shift the traffic. So yeah, all in good time. Yeah. Cool. Maybe we should wrap this up. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was great. Yeah. Really
cool. All right. Let's close this baby out and see you next time.